Of all the eukaryotic lineages, the most important for terrestrial life on Earth is the plants. Where phytoplankton are the key of the food chain for ocean ecosystems, plants are the organisms that are the base of the food chain for all terrestrial life. They produce oxygen that all eukaryotes need to breathe, including animals, fungi, and protists. Their roots form an interconnected network of fibers that hold soil together, inhibiting soil erosion. Plants hold water in their cells in huge vacuoles and help to regulate the water cycle. They produce nearly all of the food for terrestrial life as we know it. Herbivores such as rabbits can eat vegetation, and carnivores like coyotes who eat rabbits are even indirectly dependent upon that vegetation, because if the vegetation didn't exist, the rabbits wouldn't exist and the coyotes wouldn't exist. Not only do plants protect you from the shade or the wind, they also regulate global climate. For example, tropical rainforests produce most of the oxygen of all terrestrial plants and have become known as the lungs of the earth. Primary producers are the beginning of any food chain. They're organisms that convert physical energy into chemical energy, which living organisms use to go throughout their life functions. And the most important primary producers on Earth are photosynthetic. Photosynthetic organisms produce chemical energy from light energy, and they are the dominant force of carbon and energy in the world. During photosynthesis, plants reduce carbon dioxide in order to make sugar. And plants provide humans with food for eating, fuel for cooking, fibers for clothing, building materials for, building, and medicine for healing. The earliest human attempts at plant domestication occurred in southwestern Asia around 11,000 BC. And there's early evidence for conscious cultivation and trait selection of certain plants, specifically rye, by pre-Neolithic groups in Syria. But the first evidence that we really have is in 10,000 BC, and it's the bottle gourd plant. This was used as a container before the advent of ceramic technology, and it appears to have been domesticated. And it was even reached to the Americas from Asia by 8,000 BC, most likely due to the migrations of people from Asia to America. Cereal crops were first domesticated around 9000 BC in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. The first domesticated crops were generally annual species with large seeds or fruits. These included plants such as peas and wheat. The Middle East was especially suited for these species. The dry summer climate was conducive to the evolution of large-seeded annual plants, and the variety of elevation led to a great variety of species. As domestication took place, humans began to move from a hunter-gatherer society to a settled agricultural society. This change would eventually lead, some 4,000 to 5,000 years later, to the first city-states and eventually the rise of civilization itself. Continued domestication was a gradual process of trial and error that occurred intermittently. Over time, perennials and small trees began to be domesticated and include carrots, apples, and olives. Some plants were not domesticated until recently, such as the macadamia nut or the pecan. In other parts of the world, very different species were domesticated. In America, squash, corn, and beans formed the core of the diet. Potatoes were cultivated in the Andes Mountains and were the primary source of calories, which led to the rise of the Incan Empire. And in East Asia, rice and soy were developed and still form the basis of all Asian cuisine. And some areas of the world, such as Southern Africa, Australia, and even California, never saw local species domesticated. Americans have been changing corn genes through selective breeding for more than 4,000 years. Researchers have found that 3 key genes were systematically enhanced through selective cultivation over these years. The ancestral plant of corn, teosinte, was a grassy-like plant with many stems bearing small cobs with kernels sheathed in really hard shells. By cultivating plants with really desirable characteristics, these farmers caused teosinte to morph into an increasingly useful crop. And it's been said that the differences between corn and teosinte really only come down to a few genes, but with really enormous effect. If plants are the masters of land, green algae are the primary photosynthetic organisms in fresh water. Originally considered to be protists because they're single-celled eukaryotic organisms, they've been reclassified to be a part of the plant kingdom. They're considered to be the closest living relative to terrestrial plants, and this gels with genomic phylogenetics. Algae also share many morphological characteristics with plants. Unlike most eukaryotes, they have chloroplast and a cell wall. Unlike plants, they can be unicellular or colonial. They can also be multicellular. And they're most commonly found in the water, either fresh or saltwater. The transition between water-bound and terrestrial living represented a major transition in life on Earth. Of all the plants living on Earth today, these two plants are hypothesized to best represent this transition. On the left is a member of the Coelocates. These algae grow in discs that represent the basic morphology of all land plants, and one of the few algae that have this type of growth form. Stoneworts are often considered to be the first to become land plants. They are the most primitive plant that has an upright stem, and they were the tropical rainforest trees of their day, towering millimeters above the competition. Bryophytes represent the first true terrestrial plants. Bryophyte is a traditional name used to refer to all land plants that don't have true vascular tissues and are therefore usually called non-vascular plants. Some bryophytes do have specialized tissue for the transport of water. However, since these tissues do not contain lignin, they are considered not to really be true vascular plants. Currently, bryophytes are thought to be not a monophyletic group. They're paraphyletic, much like the protist. However, the name is convenient and remains to be used in a collective term for mosses, hornworts, and liverworts. Bryophytes produce enclosed reproductive structures, but produce neither flowers nor seeds. They reproduce by spores. As plants became terrestrial, they covered the land. At this point, light became the single most limiting factor affecting the fitness of plants. So growing above your competitors became one of the most important evolutionary adaptations that drove the diversification of plants on land. The development of vascular tissue was the single most important factor that allowed plants to grow upright. You can basically think of vascular tissues as straws that send water up from the roots to hydrate the leaves and sugars down from the leaves to feed the roots. And these vascular plants that came to this stage were also seedless, producing spores instead of seeds. And they fall into the following categories: the Xylophyta, Lycophyta, and Phenophyta, and also include the Pterophyta or ferns. Common types of these seedless vascular plants include the spike mosses and club mosses, horsetails, and even whisk ferns. Seedless plants were vascular, but they didn't produce any seeds. Rather, they stored tiny gametes called spores. These plants diversified to store much more nutritive tissue into their embryos in what we know today as seeds. Also, these seeds have a protective layer on the outside of them, reducing dehydration. Seed-bearing plants are the most recent group of terrestrial plants, and they are broken up into two groups: the Angiosperms, or flowering plants, and the gymnosperms, the naked seed plants. Seed plants include many groups that are very well known. Gymnosperms are known as non-flowering plants, and they're made up of the following groups. Cycads are tropical or subtropical plants with a large crown of leaves and a stout trunk. Ginkgos are broadleaf trees that produce seeds not in a cone, but not really in a fruiting body either. And there's only one known species, but more on that later. Conifers are cone-bearing plants that include pines, spruces, and firs. Angiosperms are the most famous plants in the world. They form all the plants we depend on for food, from corn and rice to tomatoes and sweet potatoes. They're commonly known as flowering plants, and all have flowers or fruits in some form. Angiosperm literally translates to vesseled seed, which means that the seeds are stored inside of a carpel. And the carpel is a protective structure of the flower. And if you think of a peanut, the carpel is the part you have to get through to get to the nut. The transition from water to land required a very important evolutionary adaptation: the cuticle. Cuticles are watertight tissue on the exterior of all land plants on Earth. Think of it kind of like the skin on yourself. It allowed plants to take water from the soil and into the leaves, and to keep water there to be used as needed. Before the cuticle, plants could live on land but required constant 24/7, 365 access to water. So plants were typically bound living close to existing water bodies. Now plants could leave the confines of water bodies and take over the world. Plants also develop spores. You can think of spores as really tiny seeds. But the most important thing is that these new plants could reproduce sexually, and their zygote is encased in a protective coating that resists dehydration. Now plants can not only live on the land, their offspring can be easily spread across the land and live for extended periods of time before germinating. These major adaptations in plant morphology is what defines the boundary of the Silurian and Devonian periods. Following the beginning of the Devonian, there is another major radiation of plant species diversity, when they're finally able to conquer the virgin lands of the continents, and they spread like wildfire. Plants required several physical adaptations in order to explode onto land. Not only did they require cuticles, they required a way to move water from the ground up to the leaves, and this required more than simple capillary action that was required by the bryophytes. These plants required water-conducting tissues called vascular tissues. The picture on the left is a cross-section of a leaf. That pink spot in the middle is the main vein of a leaf, and that is the vascular tissue. Once vascular tissue came to be, so did the roots and the leaves, and so did stomata. Stomata are specialized cells in the leaves that open and close, allowing air to get into the leaf. Recall that photosynthesis converts water, H2O, and carbon dioxide, CO2, to make sugars. Water comes up from the roots, and carbon dioxide comes into the leaves through the stomata, and therefore photosynthesis can take place. Gymnosperms were the dominant land plants in the age of dinosaurs, the Cretaceous and Jurassic periods. Gymnosperms literally translates to naked seeded plants. They have true seeds, not spores. However, they aren't enclosed in a vessel-like fruit like flowering plants. Common surviving gymnosperms are conifers, cycads, and ginkgos, and are similar in their woody habit and patterned seed of development, but none of them have true flowers or fruits. Cycads are the short woody plants with long frond-like leaves and have seeds produced in cones. Conifers such as pines, spruces, and firs all have short, scaly, or even needle-like leaves and produce seeds in a cone. Ginkgos are the only broadleaf, naked-seeded tree that exists on Earth today. And of all the ginkgos that have ever been present on Earth, only one species still exists, Ginkgo biloba. In fact, if it weren't for some plant-loving monks in China, it is likely that the ginkgo would be no more. A botanist traveling around China found this very strange tree growing in a monastery, and it didn't exist in nature. Since then, it has been cultivated and remains a popular landscaping tree. And some efforts have been conducted to establish viable populations within its native China. And if ginkgos weren't weird enough, the natophytes have got to take the cake. The natophytes have only three genera, but they are each highly variable in their own way. They do differ from other gymnosperms in that they have vessels very similar to those found in flowering plants, known as tracheids, but more on those later. So in a sense, the group of plants represent a morphological link between the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, and the angiosperms of the stars of the age in which we live. About 145 million years ago, the first true flowering plants came to the stage, and they have come to dominate as the most diverse group of land plants on Earth. Angiosperms are seed-producing plants much like the gymnosperms, but can be distinguished from the gymnosperms by a series of synapomorphies or derived characteristics. These characteristics include flowers, endosperm within the seeds, and the production of fruits that contain seeds. Angiosperms came to dominate conifers as the dominant trees only around 60 to 100 million years ago. And still to this day, gymnosperms are the sentinels of the high latitudes, especially in the north. Once plants developed the adaptations to be able to be grown on land, their diversification, flowered. They had far greater access to two key components of photosynthesis, highly limited in an aquatic environment: light and carbon dioxide. The two most important adaptations that allowed plants to become landbound were tissues that prevented the loss of water from within the plant and tissues that acted a lot like plumbing to get the water from the ground to the top of the plant. Perhaps the first adaptation was the cuticle. If you look at plants that live in water, none of them have a cuticle. They don't need it. They're continually submersed in water. The cuticle is a waxy, watertight layer that reduces water loss. And just like any good idea, it has its downside. It inhibits the exchange of gas, and plants need gas, specifically carbon dioxide, to go through photosynthesis. So plants that develop cuticles also had to develop a way of getting carbon dioxide into the leaves. And that adaptation was stomata. These are pores in the leaf that promote gas exchange. And think of them a lot like pores in a filter that allow coffee to flow through, yet retain the grounds of the coffee so they can be disposed of. These pores were created by specialized cells that look a lot like lips. When the plant releases carbon dioxide, the lips open. However, when they open, they also release water. So to conserve water, these lips, known as guard cells, can also close, preventing water loss, but also not letting gas in. So these cells are constantly opening and closing, controlling the flow of gas and water. The major benefit of growing upright for a plant is getting a competitive advantage in the battle for light. Early on, plants were really close to the ground. Think of mosses. Because as plants got taller, the upper part of the plant would dry out. Therefore, transporting water against the force of gravity was essential in the development for upright growth. Vascular tissues allowed plants to break the force of gravity by drawing water up from the roots, sort of like a straw in a soda. The biggest disadvantage of this is that these plants became floppy due to the lack of rigidity. However, they did overcome this, but more on that later. It is thought that vascularity evolved in a series of steps. The first of these steps was developing vascular tissues that were structurally rigid. In other words, they had to be strong enough to withstand the pressure of pumping water. These vascular tissues developed walls made of a scaffold or framework of a very strong substance known as lignin. Lignin formed structural support that allowed stems that were rigid enough to withstand the effects of gravity. But wait, there's more! It is thought that the second step in vascularity was the development of the tracheid. Tracheids are long, thin, tapering cells. They have two cell walls, one made of cellulose, which all plant cells have, and the other made of super strong lignin. These tracheids also have pits in the ends that act sort of like a sieve. These cells allowed water to be efficiently moved upward, and these cells are currently found in all vascular plants. But wait, there's more! If tracheids were a tremendous improvement in design over the first vascular tissues, vessel elements are the Ferraris of the vascular world. They are shorter and wider than tracheids and have large gaps on both ends, forming a very efficient pipeline for the plant to move water around. Unlike tracheids, these vessel elements line end to end, in effect making a pipe. Tracheids, on the other hand, are close to each other but don't line up end to end, so they're not nearly as efficient as the vessel elements. These structures are found in all flowering plants and the natophytes. Vascular tissues are made up of two different types of tissues, xylem and phloem. Xylem carries water up from the roots to the leaves, and phloem carries sugars down from the leaves into the roots. Just remember, xylem up, phloem down. When plants came onto land, they had to develop a way to protect their embryos from drying out. Spores were the first on the stage. They hold the embryo of seedless land plants and resist drying out due to a tough outer coat. Spores are currently found in mosses and ferns. These gametes eventually evolutionarily developed into seeds. Seeds hold gametes in complex multicellular structures in which the embryos are retained and nourished by the parent plants. Once on land, plants quickly diversified many different forms of seed dispersal. The reason for this is there is strong selection pressure that is evolutionarily disadvantageous for the offspring of a plant to be directly underneath it. So in order to avoid competition for light, water, and nutrients, plants evolve several mechanisms for getting their offspring far away from their mother plant. Seeds can be dispersed by wind in a parachute-like structure or a helicopter-like structure. They can be dispersed by animals, either by sticking to their fur or enticing them to eat them. Seeds can be dispersed by water, usually by floating, or they can burst from their seed pods, shooting seeds away from the mother plant. And humans have also become very important dispersal mechanisms whenever they began to cultivate plants. One of the most important recent developments that helped to diversify plants was pollination association. This symbiotic relationship gives plant animals the very high energy nectar and or pollen for food. Of the strangest association, some plants try to trick flies into pollinate them because they look like and smell like rotting meat. Ew. And hummingbirds can see orange and red really well. Flowers have taken advantage of this by producing very red and tubular flowers with copious nectars with which hummingbirds tend to come to. Bees can see from blue to purple to ultraviolet and are attracted to that color. And flowers that attract bees also need landing pads because bees don't really have the power to hover, so they need a place to land. Flowering plants are broken up into two main groups, monocots and dicots. A monocotyledon is the first leaf that comes out after a seed germinates. Monocots are called that because they have one cotyledon, and dicots have two cotyledons when they germinate. However, monocots and dicots do have many other differences. Monocots have their vascular tissue scattered throughout the stem, and in contrast, dicots have circular vascular tissue arrangement, forming a ring of vascularity. Also, monocots have parallel veins, and dicots typically have a branching vein network. But perhaps the most telling difference between the monocots and the dicots is its floral structure. Monocots almost always have floral parts such as petals and parts of 3, 6, 9, 12, whereas dicots typically have petals and multiples of 4s or 5s.